It's done. Okay, so welcome back everyone for the second lecture. So today I'll start by looking at linear stability analysis, first for ODE systems and then set up the structure for PDE systems as well. And we'll work out some examples, some simple problems. And also when we do the linear stability analysis for the ODE for the PDE systems, we'll be able to start classifying the kind of pattern forming instabilities that occur in these systems. So yesterday I started with the example where I said I'm going to look at dx by dt is r times x minus x cubed as a standard example of a dynamical system. And so we wanted to understand, how do you get that from some physical arguments? And that's where I stopped last time. And the way to think about this is just the following. So let's say you have a particle moving in some potential, right? So some confining potential of that form. Surely you can write down equations of motion for the particle. So where you would have x dot equal to v and v dot equal to, or mv dot equal to minus du dx. So this would describe the classical Hamiltonian picture. I don't want to look at Hamiltonian orbits. I know the system is embedded in some environment, so there is some dissipation always going on. So therefore, I'll put in some damping terms. The simplest level. Okay, and so this is basically an overdamped limit of that. Right. So what I've said is basically the following problem, that I'm going to neglect the inertial term. And so you recognize V is nothing but x dot. So therefore you can choose your units appropriately. So therefore x dot, which is V, is just the derivative of the potential. And I chose this potential to illustrate some simple ideas now. Okay, so yesterday we did the following, that we found out the fixed points. So we did it for the x dot equal to r times x minus x cubed system, overdamped limit. By the way, I'll interchange dx dt and x dot means the time derivative. And we classified the fixed points as basically something that there is a 0 and plus minus root r. And this only exists for r positive, non negative. This always exists. And we also saw the bifurcation diagram where we saw that there is the r equal to 0 state, x star equal to 0 state, which loses instability at some point. And at that point, two new states appear. The plus minus root r solutions. And these are the ones which are stable for r positive. Right? So this is a bifurcation diagram. The legend here is that a solid line denotes a stable fixed point, a dashed line denotes a unstable fixed point. This is common convention. So this is a bifurcation diagram that we saw, and so which clearly shows that for r equal to 0, which is the tuning point, the x star equal to 0 solution becomes unstable. We did the linear stability analysis. And then the plus minus root r solutions are the only stable ones. So I want you to do the following, that I want you to work this out in explicit detail, but I'll do the general formalism, but I want you to do the homework problem. So look at the underdamped case. That is, you have x dot equal to v and v dot equal to minus du dx minus v, where u is whatever I wrote yesterday, rx squared by 2 minus some x4 by 4. And show what are the fixed points. First of all, find out the fixed points. So now your dynamical system has two variables, x and v. You're supposed to find the fixed points for both the variables and find out the fixed points and then work out their stability. And work out the stability for all values of r. Remember, this is the r axis. and show that you will get the same results. So this I'll leave it as an exercise. Please do this. So whether the system has or does not have inertia, as soon as you have damping, you will eventually get the same fixed points, and even the stability does not matter. So please work that out in detail. Yeah, minus or plus that with a minus. Thank you. Okay, so the general setup, therefore, is the following, right? That you have a system of ODEs, and you would like to find out the fixed points of the system of ODEs, and then from the fixed points, figure out their stabilities. So that's the general trick of linear stability analysis. So let's do it in a more general setup. So let's say I have a vector of dynamical variables. So some U1, U2, U3 up to UN. And you have an evolution equation vectorially as basically something that takes in this set of variables and gives. So f is in general some nonlinear function. And as before, you try to find the fixed points U star that satisfy f of U star equal to 0. So there could be many fixed points, and your job is to find out the stability of each one of them in turn. And you can do that for any arbitrary U star, pick one of the fixed points, and you'll be able to see the setup quite simply. So to analyze the stability around some fixed point U star. So I do a perturbation, and therefore, as usual, I try to get the use the dot notation. I try to get the evolution equation for the perturbation, and you should be able to work that out. So this will basically be f at U star plus delta U, which you can do a Taylor series expansion. And so basically write this as some Jacobian matrix, right, times delta U plus higher order terms. Okay, so basically the stability is really governed by the Jacobian matrix. So J is the derivative of f with respect to the U variables evaluated at U equal to U star. So remember, that will be a matrix in general. And so therefore, you would like to find out how the properties of that matrix will govern the stability. Now, once you find the Jacobian matrix, surely you can find its eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And if the eigenvalues are all not defective, then you can show that the eigenfunctions form a nice basis set for expanding any solution. So therefore, remember, to this order, once you neglect this, the system becomes a linear system. So it's basically delta U dot is some matrix times delta U. So it's basically a linear system. And so therefore, the general solution for such a case would basically be an expansion in the eigenbasis. So delta U as a function of time t would have the following variables, right? So you'd have some variables. Let's say I'll do it for a 2x2 system, but you can do it for any let's do it for n by n times wi e to the lambda I, where the wi are such that they are the eigenvectors with eigenvalues lambda. Okay, is it fine? Can everybody see through this? Okay, so therefore it's really the eigenvalues of the Jacobian matrix that determine the stability. So stability of the fixed point is. So if all lambda I, or in general, the real part of lambda I is less than 0 for all I, then the system is stable. Right? Because any perturbation in any direction, any arbitrary direction, which you can resolve in terms of the basis vectors themselves. So any perturbation in any arbitrary direction is going to decay. So therefore, it's stable with respect to perturbations in any arbitrary direction. On the other hand, if this condition is not satisfied, in the sense that if there is even one eigenvalue whose real part is positive, this is an unstable system. Fine? So therefore, use this general setup to actually solve this two-variable system that I have. And work this out as a homework problem and see if the conclusions that we had yesterday about the fixed point x star equal to 0 and the fixed point x star equal to plus minus root r. And surely you'll be able to show that the fixed points is v equal to 0 for the second. See if the conclusions change. So the general procedure is therefore the following, right? That you have a nonlinear system, you linearize the system about a fixed point. And you diagonalize the Jacobian matrix, and the eigenvalues of that will basically tell you. So that is the general procedure, and that's the thing that you should keep in mind. And this is the same procedure will go through for PD systems. The trick will be to sort of understand what you mean by diagonalizing J. It's marginally stable. You can't say anything at the linear level. You'll have to go to a higher
level. Vijay, there's a question. Is the general formalism of linear stability analysis applicable for both autonomous and non-autonomous nonlinear ODEs?
Autonomous and non-autonomous. So non-autonomous, so far only considered autonomous systems in that there isn't an explicit function of time. You can put in non-autonomous systems. It becomes difficult to say anything because you'll have to specify the non-autonomous driving. You can have some constants, for example, here. I mean, that is also some driving that is there. This formalism will go through. That's not a problem. If there's an explicit function of time, difficult to say anything. You'll have to work out case by case. I don't know if there's a general formalism. Okay, all right. So do a couple of examples before we go to the PDE model. So again, another homework problem that I want you to do, because this will turn out to be have a nice relationship to the kind of okay. So I want you to do the following. So from now on, I'll therefore forget inertia. I mean, for ODE systems, you can think of them like some O-damped limit of Newton's laws. More abstractly, think of them as a set of abstract differential equations that are there. So I want you to do the following. I want you to sort of explore this dynamical system. We will do some variant of this when we do polarity patterns, maybe tomorrow. So I want you to explore the ODE variant of that. So I have a dynamical system, which is like U dot equal to lambda U minus U cubed, which is the same as what we analyzed there. Now I just put in a constant B. Okay, so there are two control parameters, lambda and B. And I want you to sit down and work out the fixed points of the system, the stability of the fixed points, and also plot the bifurcations. So find out the fixed points and their stability. And also sort of plot for me the fixed point U star versus the control parameter lambda for the cases where B is less than 0, B is equal to 0, and B is greater than 0.
There's one question, what if Jacobian has a 0 eigenvalue?
So that is the same statement as the derivative vanishing there. So to linear order, you can't say anything. You'll have to go to higher order. In fact, we will find out when we go to looking at when the system does undergo an instability, the eigenvalue or the real part of the eigenvalue, the largest real part of the eigenvalue of all the eigenvalues there, when that crosses 0 is the instability threshold. So that's basically the point where the eigenvalue will cross 0. Okay, so I want you to work out this, and I also want you to do the following, that you do a similar phase diagram, bifurcation diagram, but now in the U star B plane, and again at lambda less than 0, equal to 0, and greater than 0. So work this out and tell me the kind of plots that you get, and maybe after that, plot some sort of a, what do you call, a phase diagram. So this is in the B lambda plane. And tell me the kind of phases that are there in the sense of the fixed point. So there's a fixed point which is like U equal to 0, or maybe U not equal to 0. Maybe if you change lambda and B, there's some other fixed points. And so are there multiple fixed points in the B lambda plane, regions of that, and regions where there's only one fixed point? So work this out in detail. So this undergoes what's called a cusp bifurcation, which is a very useful thing. So we'll come back to this model, and it's slightly more generalized version, including PDs, when we discuss cell polarity models. Okay, so far what we've said is to look at.
Excuse me, sir. So here we have B and lambda, two parameters. So total 339 cases will be there. So we have to work out all the 9 cases, like B less than 0, lambda less than 0, those kind of things.
If you can work out in general, but if you can do just U star versus lambda at 3 values and the other 3 values, it will not be the same. Qualitatively, you won't get anything.
Okay.
Okay. So one thing I've sort of definitely ignored so far is the following fact. If you had a one variable system, then there is basically the derivative, which I forgot somewhere. Okay, it's basically the derivative that tells you whether the fixed point is stable or unstable. And in fact, the sign of the derivative. But as soon as you go to more than one variable, systems of equations, you can get many eigenvalues, and in particular, you can get complex eigenvalues. So therefore, you can get what is called a oscillatory instability. So in the sense that if you have a system of 2 variables, so let's work out this case in a bit of a detail. Again, this will be something which will be useful for classifying oscillatory patterns. So I have 2 variables, U1 and U2, with the following equations. So there is lambda U1 minus omega U2, and U1 square plus U2 square times U1, and U2 dot is lambda U2 plus omega U1, and as usual, U1 square, 2 square, U2. So this is very close to the system that we explored here, but for a two-variable parameter system. Can you please explore this? So maybe it helps to look at a polar representation. So where you say U1 comma U2 are basically rho 1 cosine phi, or rho cosine phi, and rho sine phi. Can you please get me the equations for rho dot and phi dot? Quickly. So rho is non-negative and phi is between 0 and 2 pi. Quickly, please. So here's the split. I'll do the phi equation, you do the rho equation. So the phi equation is that's all. You do the rho equation. So work this out. This just turns out to be lambda rho minus rho cube. So that's basically the same system that we looked at earlier. We know its bifurcation diagram quite well. So in fact, you know that for lambda less than 0, there's only one fixed point, and that fixed point is rho star equal to 0. So if rho star is 0, so which means rho eventually goes to 0, well, then phi is undefined. I mean, you can put, so first of all, the system gets decoupled, so there's nothing to do. I mean, so phi is arbitrary there. However, if lambda is positive, you know there is another fixed point, which is plus minus root lambda, but rho is positive, so therefore there's only the plus root lambda. And now look at the dynamics of U. So phi dot is omega, so which means phi increases linearly in time, and rho is some positive number. So therefore U1 and U2 will oscillate. Does that make sense? Yes? No? And so formally do the following, that work out the Jacobian matrix, work out its eigenvalues, and show the following, that for lambda less than 0, all eigenvalues have the real part to be negative. And for lambda positive, there is an eigenvalue whose real part is positive, and its imaginary part, I shouldn't have used lambda for something. So lambda here is a control parameter and not one of the eigenvalues. Rats. That's all right. Yeah. So show that the imaginary part of the eigenvalues is not equal to 0. So this is a classical example of the half bifurcation. So the statement is that for capital lambda greater than 0, the system enters what's called a limit cycle. So independent of initial conditions, so you put U1 and U2 at some arbitrary points, eventually the long time behavior for capital lambda greater than 0 will be that the system will come and sit in some circle or some loop in the U1, U2 space, and it will just keep going around there. So you should contrast that with the harmonic oscillator, where the size of that loop depends on the initial condition. So here the initial conditions will go away after some time, some transients. Eventually you get a cycle, which is like the attractor for the dynamics. This is fine. This is all trivial. Everybody has seen this. Okay. So what we've done so far is to set up a linear stability picture for looking at one variable ODE systems or n variable ODE systems. And you can classify the fixed points and their stability by looking at the eigenvalues of the Jacobian matrix at the fixed points. And so the properties of the eigenvalues basically tell you whether the fixed points are stable or unstable. So now we want to go to PDE systems and set up a similar linear stability analysis and try to ask how will you generalize this to look at a system which has not just temporal dependence, but also spatial degrees of freedom. So you have to bring in the aspect that the system is spatially extended and set up a similar linear stability analysis, and there we will classify the kind of instabilities that can happen. So far, so good about ODE systems.
So Vijay, this if fixed point goes to a limit cycle, you call it a Hopf bifurcation.
No, the bifurcation where at capital lambda equals to 0 is the Hopf bifurcation.
No,
there was a fixed point, stationary fixed point.
Yeah.
And suddenly you got a
limit cycle.
A limit cycle coming up.
I mean, so is like if a fixed point goes to, let's say, 2 fixed points or something, what's that called? That's also a Hopf.
No, that was a pitchfork bifurcation.
Oh, that's pitchfork. Okay.
Yeah, this is a pitchfork. I always forget the name, so don't hold me to that. I always have to look up in a book. So this is a pitchfork. So you go from one stationary point to 2 stationary points. And that one goes from one stationary point to a limit cycle. That's a Hopf bifurcation. Okay. While I erase, think and ask if there are questions about the linear stability answers for ODE systems. So now we turn to PDE systems. By definition, these are things where the dynamical variables have both spatial and temporal dependence. So of course, you can write it in D dimensions. I'll start with 1D, and we'll mostly look at 1D and 2D systems. But the analysis is rather general. I mean, you don't lose anything by looking at one-dimensional systems. So the classical setup, which I showed a video of yesterday. So keep this in mind when we discuss these examples. So it will be helpful. So let's say you have a fluid which is confined between 2 plates. So there's a fluid which is between these 2 plates. So the plates have some separation between them, D, and you have a fluid in between here. And what you do is to maintain the temperature of the bottom system to be at a higher temperature, and the temperature of the top layer, top plate, to be at some lower temperature. So delta T is positive. This is a classic example of what is called a Rayleigh-Bénard convection. And this is something that I showed you a video of. You can do this in your kitchen experiment. Just put some liquid on a pan, heat it up, and as the temperature goes up, beyond a certain point, you will start seeing convection rolls. So even before the temperature difference, surely there is heat conduction going through. You're supplying heat at the bottom, and there is some liquid here, and heat is being conducted. At some temperature difference, the conduction state becomes unstable, and you set up into a convection state. So that means there'll be a mass movement of the fluid packets. So you can visualize that with some food coloring or something like that. You will get very nice states coming up here. So this is a classic experiment where the general features that we are thinking about pattern formation in non-equilibrium systems is that there are boundaries where you are forcing the system. And let's say this temperature delta T, T1 plus delta T, is uniform throughout the bottom layer, and there is a T1 temperature uniform. So therefore, there is no spatial heterogeneity imposed by the driving. Whatever the fixed points of the system that come up are completely autonomous in that sense. There is homogeneous driving throughout the system. There are multiple fixed points. Some of them lose their stability as you change the parameters of the problem, and some of them gain stability, or maybe some of them don't even exist for certain parameter values. And that's how you get a phase transition or a pattern forming bifurcation coming up here. So this is also true for chemical systems, for example, for reaction diffusion problems that I'm going to consider. So there too, you have a chamber, an agarose chamber, a gel, some gel, wherein you put in a bunch of chemicals here. And above and below, you have reservoirs of chemicals, the chemical 1 and chemical 2, let's say. And this is the system that you're going to study. So you can pump in material, or you can suck out material in the reservoirs. So therefore, you have a flux of material into the system that you're studying. And what you do is to make sure that the flux is uniform throughout the reservoir. So therefore, the pumping in or sucking out is uniform. There's no spatial heterogeneity that you put into the system by hand. Once you have this system, maybe there are 2 chemicals, maybe there are 10 chemicals, they somehow come in, do some interactions between them, and whatever the patterns come up are because of the kind of instabilities that occur due to their interaction. Fine? A similar picture. Some of the patterns that I'll show on the cell surface, or even in tissues, you can draw similar analogies. So if you remember, if you don't remember, I'll show you again later on. So the cell has a nice polymeric structure, polymeric meshwork of filaments just beneath its plasma membrane. So this is the plasma membrane of the cell, or the cell membrane. And this is a structure which is a polymeric meshwork of actin and myosin filaments. And what you have is a system where this set of filaments and proteins are in constant exchange with the bulk of the cell, right? So they can polymerize, they can depolymerize. So it's like there is a flux of material being maintained in the cell. In a tissue, for instance, where you have loads and loads of cells sitting here, there's always cell death and cell birth. So this tissue, for instance, consumes resources from the surrounding, which is like a reservoir. And then it does something. Maybe some cells die, maybe some cells take birth. That's like a flux of material coming into the system. So the general picture that you should keep in mind is something where you have some part of the domain which you are forcing in, some maybe energy, maybe chemistry, maybe molecules, maybe cells, maybe nutrients, I don't know. There's some complicated dynamics happening in the system, which is what we want to model, and look at the ensuing patterns in the problem. Okay, so most of the time we'll look at the dynamics in the so-called XY plane, because the other direction would be the forcing direction. And so therefore the patterns that you would see in the transverse plane will be autonomous in that sense. A very non-biological, non-fluidy example, which is also something that we have a lab here, is granular materials, where we have a plate. Okay, that doesn't look rectangular. Or maybe circular. We have a horizontal plate in which there are a bunch of granular particles, maybe rods, maybe point particles, whatever you want to think. And we shake the rod up and down, shake the plate up and down vertically in the direction of gravity. So that is sort of the influx of energy. And looking at the kind of patterns, the kind of dynamics that comes in the plane is an example of a driven non-equilibrium system. So in some sense, all these fall in the class of active materials. Now, the dynamics can be more complicated. So rather than having simple point particles, you could have things which have orientational degrees of freedom. So even here, sometimes the orientation of the filaments does matter, for example, in the case of cell division. And so you have to worry about not just the dynamics of scalar fields, but maybe vector fields and tensor fields as well. Okay, so the general setup, therefore, is that a pattern forming system can be described by a set of partial differential equations and we will write them in general as first order derivatives in time, and whatever is on the right hand side can be functions of u, some grad u, so on. So u is some vectorial thing. Now this, you don't lose any generality. If you have a second order derivative in time, you rewrite it as two first order equations. So that's easy to do.
Vijay,
yeah.
Can there be dependence of f on u dot?
Which is what I've said. I've pulled in all the u dot onto this side.
Sorry?
I've said I've pulled all the u dots onto this side. So what do you mean by dependence on u dot?
I'm coupling between different.
So it's like a u dot square or something.
Yeah,
I'll rewrite that as a system of first order equations.
Even if it is on H.
Solve it, write it as u dot equal to something, some nonlinear, to put square roots, whatever. So f is some general nonlinear thing. Okay, so you would like to find out, therefore, so maybe even before that, some examples. So for instance, if you have the heat equation or the diffusion equation, that's an example of an equation like that. Now, on top of that, you can put in some chemistry, chemical reactions, for instance. So this is the classical formalism of reaction diffusion equations, or equations that you would know from, let's say, even Maxwell's equations as second order in time, second order in space. You can rewrite them as coupled systems of first order equations, or even the Schrodinger equation. So the general setup is still the same, that you can look at the fixed points and you want to look at their stability. Okay. Now there is a problem. In the ODE case, when I said fixed points, I basically meant you look at the solution of f equal to 0. And that was typically some polynomial equations and, okay, some complicated set. Maybe you could solve analytically, maybe you could not solve, but it's still an algebraic problem. Here, there is a spatial degree of freedom. And so therefore, even if I ask for solutions where f vanishes, that's still a partial differential equation. Therefore, you didn't gain much. I mean, yeah, it's quite nonlinear. What you set out was to find steady state solutions. So maybe you remove the time dependence, but you probably had complicated coupled nonlinear partial differential equations in several variables if you're doing in more than one space dimension. So you didn't gain much. I mean, it's still the same headache. What do you do then? In general, we don't know to do much beyond this. There are very few examples where you can solve those equations exactly. And so usually, this is what is typically the case. What you look for are homogeneous fixed points or homogeneous steady states. Okay, so that's the case where the fixed point U star is independent of space. And then you can do the linear stability analysis. You will still land up with a partial differential equation system. But because the system is assumed to be in a homogeneous steady state, that's your starting point. And we are going to do a linear stability analysis. So what you'll land up with will basically be a system of coupled linear partial differential equations. So that's reasonably tractable. Okay. And you'll see technically why the assumption of homogeneous steady state is important. So before we go there, let me do the more general thing that we don't assume homogeneous steady state and see what happens. Suppose you found a fixed point. I mean, I don't know how you found it. Let's say you found it. So that's a function of R, right? That's some inhomogeneous fixed point. I can ask for its stability and you do the same procedure like what we did earlier. And what you get is that U written as a perturbation around U star, you can derive an equation for W, the perturbation, which is rather easy. So this will basically be the derivative of F at U equal to U star times W, and second derivatives and so on and so forth. So remember now these are functional derivatives. Right? Okay. So the trick is still the same. I mean, the meaning of the Jacobian operator is a complicated thing because this is an operator in infinite dimensions. It's a functional Jacobian. It's still linear. I mean, the ensuing equations that you get are still linear. So maybe you can do something. Okay. So look at some examples. And so maybe that will set up, and then we'll come back to the homogeneous steady state. So for instance, the Ginzburg-Landau equation. I have some variable U, and I write the evolution equation for U as basically something which is RU minus U cubed. But this time I add in a diffusion term. Okay, so I mean the fixed points are again U equal to 0 and or U star equal to 0 and plus minus root R. These are the homogeneous solutions. These are obviously solutions of the differential equation if you just plug them in there. You can ask for the stability of these things and do a similar process. And what you will, again, do this exercise for me, please, that you will do a perturbation like so. That is, you put U is equal to U star plus W and show that the differential equation for W that you get is basically the following: R minus 3 U star squared times W plus dx square. So do it in one dimension for now. So this is basically a operator J acting on W. So the operator is basically something where U star squared plus dx squared. It's a differential operator. Okay. So you put this, you do the linearization and show that this is the operator. So in a sense, the statement about finding the eigenvalues of the Jacobian is really boiling down to finding the eigenvalues of this differential operator, linear differential operator.
I have a question. So the fixed points.
Can you use that? Yeah.
The fixed points are calculated here by assuming the homogeneous steady state, right?
Right. You can show that even if you assume some inhomogeneity, this is just going to homogenize everything. So this is a linear thing. So there's nothing else you'll get.
So are we dealing with equations which have no explicit space dependence?
I'll make some general statements now. So we are looking at things which don't have explicit space dependence, explicit time dependence either. So that would be some sourcing, fluxing, forcing terms where you've broken temporal dependence, time translation invariance, or space translation invariance. The classic example is boundary-driven problems. Right? So I take some diffusion equation, I put some concentration reservoir here, and surely you'll get a non-trivial solution. But that is something which is being driven by the boundary in the plane that you're looking at, in the lateral direction. So what I'm thinking about is to look at pattern formation in like the XY plane here, but the driving is from the transverse direction. So there's no explicit space dependence in the directions that I'm looking at. So therefore, whatever the patterns come about are because of the instabilities in the equation. It will be non-autonomous, right? Because if I put a ODE system and I put some f of t driving, is that autonomous or non-autonomous? Okay, so let's get back to the homogeneous steady states. And in the homogeneous steady states, set up the problem for looking at the linear stability analysis. So assuming homogeneous steady states, oh wow, this is nice. Like you did, for instance, here. So there is some U star, and that U star is a number. So it's independent of space. Like you assumed U star to be plus minus of Dhar. So what you get is a system of equations which are coupled linear PDEs with constant coefficients. Aha, okay. So then if the geometry is simple, for example, a straight line or a rectangle or some circle or something like that, then this is a problem in just some Fourier domain, right? So I can do a Fourier transform and I can find the eigenvalues of the operator and set up my problem as basically an algebra. Okay, I'll illustrate this with an example, but just see if that makes sense in general. So there are a couple of things. So one is if you have a homogeneous steady state, that's when you can actually get a system of PDEs, linear PDEs with constant coefficients. That's important. This statement of having system of PDEs with constant coefficients is also a reflection of the fact that you have space translation invariance of the steady state that you're looking at. So there are Fourier solutions that you can very clearly use for such systems. So therefore, if you can find the solutions, so if you can find the eigensystem for the operator J, then I know how to expand the perturbation. Classical ideas, right? So you would have something where this would be basically some same thing. Where J has the lambda I and the Wi as the eigenvalues. Is this making sense, or does it become a bit too abstract? And then the criteria for pattern formation will be identical then. That if the eigenvalues are such that the real parts of the eigenvalues are negative for all values I, for all modes I, then the system is stable. But if this is not satisfied, that is, at least there are one or more than one eigenvalues which have a real part positive, then the system is unstable. Okay, so let's illustrate this abstract procedure for the Ginzburg-Landau.
Yeah, Vijay, I have
Yeah.
a question. So in this equation, if we have some nonlinear term like
In which
U
equation?
del X,
In which
can
equation?
we this Ginzburg-Landau equation?
This is nonlinear, no?
Yeah, no, I'm terms like U into del U del X. Then
Okay.
can we assume this homogeneous steady state?
I mean, the idea is that you try to find if there is a homogeneous steady state, and then you can do some linear stability analysis. If you cannot find any homogeneous steady state, there's very little you can do analytically. First of all, the equations that you'll construct here, I don't want to go into the physics of that. There will be some symmetry considerations that will come up. No? So you may not even be allowed to have a term like U times dxu.
Okay.
Depending on the kind of symmetries that you impose onto the field U.
Okay, but after that, like even if I assume some homogeneous steady state,
Yes.
then also I will get terms like W into del XW kind of terms. Okay.
Which means you only retain terms to lowest order in W.
Okay.
So far, so good?
I have a question here, sir. So you said that for the criteria for the pattern formation will be when the system is stable or it's unstable.
It's the same criteria, whether the fixed point is stable or unstable. The homogeneous fixed point, when that is unstable,
Okay.
well, it surely means that the system is going into some inhomogeneous fixed point.
Okay.
And so that's typically a pattern state. Now, what is that pattern state is almost impossible to find out analytically. There are very few examples where you can find out that.
Okay, sir.
You can make a guess, and then you can look if that solution satisfies the full nonlinear PDE. But most of the time, the recourse is to numerics. There is not much that one can do.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
why do you call instabilities lead to pattern? Because you're saying ki if these are unstable fixed points, there will be inhomogeneous.
So we've looked at all. Let's say you look at all the homogeneous steady states of the problem. So that means you have a system where there is no spatial heterogeneity. The U field or whatever the set of U fields is homogeneous. You do a linear stability analysis. You perturb that and you find out whether the system is stable or unstable. If that state is unstable, that means that homogeneous state is unstable. It is possible that that homogeneous state is unstable, but there is some other homogeneous state which is stable, but which is basically a ODE system, right? From one homogeneous. If it turns out, we'll work out this, that the non-uniform perturbations which are spatially dependent, not spatially homogeneous, if they grow, then that means the homogeneous state is unstable. Well, the definition of a pattern is have some sort of a inhomogeneity in space. And so therefore, if you're shown that the homogeneous state is unstable, you are probably going into some inhomogeneous state. That's a pattern. Is that fine?
So if we have, if the homogeneous state is unstable, couldn't there be chaos also possible? Can we call that pattern as well?
Yeah. I mean, any spatial heterogeneity is in general a pattern, typically. But I mean, things which are driven explicitly by boundaries in the XY direction. I mean, it's not so. There are also patterns in some sense, but they're not so non-intuitive. I mean, you know that something is being driven by the boundaries. Yeah, there are PDEs with chaotic solutions too. Kuramoto-Shevchinski is a classic example. Yeah, you had it.
Yeah. Okay.
These eigenvalues can be completely imaginary also.
Yeah, of course.
So
anything that you did for ODE systems goes through here.
So then again, it's like marginally stable enough.
Yeah, all those things. So if the eigenvalue is just 0, then it's marginally stable, and beyond 0 is the instability. The eigenvalues can be complex. In fact, we'll classify the pattern forming instabilities by looking at the nature of the eigenvalues as a function of the wave number of the perturbation. I want to do that a little slowly because that is the crux of the whole pattern formation story. Okay. All right. So let's work out this for the case of the Ginzburg-Landau equation, and maybe it will become easier to see.
Sir, I have a question here.
Yeah.
So in the solution, we wrote that only real part we are carrying here.
Yeah.
But if we have non-zero imaginary part, that will create oscillations in the solutions. So
only if the real part is positive. If the real part is negative, then you get damped oscillations, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so let's do this calculation for the case of the Ginzburg-Landau equation, and then you will see what you mean by eigenvalues and blah, blah, blah. So you'll basically get a kind of a spectrum of the perturbations of the operator, and the nature of that spectrum will basically tell you the kind of instabilities that are possible. Now, pattern formation is extremely broad. I mean, it's almost impossible to cover even a tiny fraction of that, because any set of differential equations, partial differential equations, has some sort of a non-trivial solutions, will give rise to patterns, and the natural world is full of that. Okay, so let's set up the Ginzburg-Landau equation, and I want you to help me with the linear stability analysis. So I have the field U, which has the equation You can start with something with lots of dimensions, put a d, put a lambda, blah, 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 non-dimensionalize it. I'll start with this thing. So I'm assuming you can do the non-dimensionalization yourself. So there are fixed points, homogeneous fixed points. U star equal to 0 and U star equal to plus minus root r. So I would like to find out whether the U star equal to 0 fixed point is a stable fixed point or an unstable fixed point for arbitrary perturbations. So now I want to perturb the system, right? But this is the crucial difference from a ODE system. In the ODE system, when you said a perturbation, you just meant a perturbation away from the fixed point, just the value of the variable. But here you have a spatio-temporal system. So a perturbation can be away from the fixed point value, but that perturbation could itself depend on space. So you could have an inhomogeneous perturbation. That means the W itself depends on R. And that makes sense, right? If you say the system is stable and the homogeneous state is stable, I want it to be stable not just with respect to perturbations about the value of the fixed point, but also about inhomogeneous perturbations. So the picture is the following. So let's say I have found a steady state U star of X, U star, and you said that that's some homogeneous value. So this is U. So this is U star. And what I want to do is to perturb the system by putting in spatial fluctuations. So this is like a perturbation which is different for every value of X. So one way to think about it intuitively is that you have this field U of X comma T, right? So as physicists, maybe think of it like a discretized set. So basically you have this as U1, which is basically, let's say you discretize, U1, which is U at X1 comma T, or Ui, which is U. And so therefore you have a vector of variables, which is like Ui. And in the limit, when the discretization number of points goes to infinity, you get a continuous system. So in some sense, this is basically, quote unquote, a dynamical system with a very large number of variables. And so now in the ODE system, when you were saying I'm going to do an arbitrary perturbation, surely you are going to put a perturbation at an arbitrary vectorial direction in the U1, U2, U3 space. In the spatial case, when you want to put an arbitrary perturbation in any of the UI variable, that really means you're putting different perturbations at different space points. Fine? And so therefore, I want the system to be stable against any arbitrary perturbation. And that's when I'll say the homogeneous state is stable. If it turns out that there are inhomogeneous perturbations which will destabilize the homogeneous state, well, very likely there's going to be a pattern. Okay, so we follow this procedure, and let's say you look at the U star equal to 0 fixed point, and look at the stability around that. So like I said, I want you to show that this will turn out to be basically R plus dx square. That's basically the operator J acting on. Is this fine? So like I remarked earlier, this is a constant coefficient PDE. So therefore, the eigenfunctions of that J operator are basically Fourier modes. So this continues here. And so if I use a Fourier decomposition, let's say I put in a perturbation which is of the form e to the iqx. I ask how does dtw change with time. You should be able to show that this is basically the following. So there is a lambda of q times e to the times w itself, where lambda of q is R minus Q square. So what you got was a
Vijay, you're looking at the infinite line or some periodic, is it, or boundary condition?
Say it again.
You're assuming an infinite line or
yeah. So I mean, I haven't said anything about Q, so therefore I haven't said.
Or on a ring, is it?
No, I haven't said anything about Q. So if you restrict the values of Q, then you are on some finite domain, maybe with periodic bound. So this is applicable even for both infinite or bounded domains.
But in a box, you would have different eigenstates, right? I mean,
so if I had a box with a finite domain or whatever boundary condition, then the range of Q will be restricted. Some beta n pi by whatever n. On the other hand, if I really have an infinite domain, then Q is infinity to infinity. Right?
Yeah, but it may not even be to the IQX, right? It could be sine or cos or something. And then you would have to worry about boundary conditions for the PD.
You're saying I may not have this. Okay, sure. I mean, I agree with that. Okay, so for now, let's do periodic boundaries or infinite boundaries. It won't change anything. It will just put some sine and cos, or you just look at some real part or imaginary part depending on the boundary conditions. You're right. So if I have a finite size system with specific boundary conditions, I have to look at reference spectrum. Okay, so let's say you have an unbounded system to start with. Okay, so what you have is a sort of the spectrum or the growth rate of the perturbations. And now here's the question. Where did that go? Yeah. Let's maybe do it a little bit more generally. So this, can you remind me, was the 3R0 square? It was 3R0 square, right? R minus 3R0 square. R minus 3 minus that. So you can keep that in general. Okay. So I look at either fixed point, u star equal to 0 or u star equal to plus minus u star. Okay, so this gives you the spectrum or basically the growth rate of the perturbations. So I would like you to do the following. Plot this for me as a function of Q. For u star equal to 0. And plot this, there is still one control parameter, which is R. And plot this for different values of R. Okay, try this, please. So at u star equal to 0, so this term goes, so this is basically R minus Q square. And let's start with negative R, because we know R is the control parameter. R less than 0, u star is stable in the homogeneous case. And R greater than 0, the u star equal to 0 state is unstable. So when I have R negative, can you plot the spectrum for me, please? So first of all, what is its value at Q equal to 0? Some value, some minus R. And then does it go up? Does it come down? Does it stay flat as a function of Q? Is the question clear? Okay, the question is also not clear. So I'm trying to do the following. I have a PDE system which has a couple of homogeneous fixed points. I'm perturbing the PDE system about the homogeneous fixed points, and I'm putting in a inhomogeneous perturbation, linearizing the system, and writing the effective equation for the amplitude of the perturbation, or basically the perturbation itself, and then asking whether that perturbation at wave number Q grows or decays. Now, that's a function rather than a set of eigenvalues. And I'm asking you plot that function as a function of the wavelength of the perturbation, wave number of the perturbation. Is this fine?
Why we inserted -3u star like?
So this is the homework I gave you, right? Because I showed you that if you take the system, do linear stability analysis around the fixed point u star, then you get the perturbations grow in this fashion. So if u star is 0, then of course you get r minus dx squared.
Okay. You initially changed something in the equation as well. I think I missed that part in the second part of the board, which is not visible.
So I didn't change anything. So let me rewrite. It's confusing.
We cannot see you where you're writing.
You can't see me?
Yeah, I think it's not under the scope of the camera.
Oh, so you were not seeing whatever I was writing?
I was seeing, but right now what we are writing is not visible.
Where am I? Can you see me?
No.
Where are Vijay, you're not in the field. Now I can see you.
Yeah, now.
Oh, okay. So the IT people are not following.
But
I think they need to move the camera maybe. Like now we can see you, but it's like a small portion of the board.
Am I visible now?
No. So this right side is visible basically. So where you are writing, it's okay.
Why is the camera not visible? Okay, anyway, I'll work this out. I'll just restate whatever I did. So I started with the Ginzburg-Landau equation. So please make sure that you get this. The rest of them is just a complicated variant of the set of equations. And I said that there are homogeneous fixed points, which is 0. And remember, these are independent of space. And I'm asking for the stability of these fixed points. And so I do a perturbation, which is spatially dependent. And I ask, does this grow or decay? So I try to answer that by assuming the perturbation is small in some units, if you want to use star. And so therefore, I write the linearized equations for the evolution of the perturbation. And I get dtw is r minus 3 u star squared minus dx squared acting on w, where u star is either 0 or plus minus root r. So far, so good. Does it make sense now? Which one should be plus? You're right. Jumping in Fourier space. Yeah. Is that fine?
Yeah, I think yes.
So that is all I did. And from there on, I said, take W to be okay. So let's say you take the perturbation to be something like IQX and plug this in. And so therefore you will get dtw as basically r minus 3 u star squared minus q squared acting on w. So which you can identify as the growth rate lambda acting on w. The growth rate now, rather than being a number for a one variable ODE, is a function of the wave number of the perturbation q. So all I'm asking you now is plot for me the function lambda of q. So lambda of q is r minus 3 u star squared minus q squared. So start from the u star equal to 0 state and plot lambda of Q versus Q. So maybe first start with R negative. So at R equal to R some negative value, it starts from some negative value, and then it goes quadratically down. Does it make sense? Yes, no? Okay.
Yes.
And now, yeah. And now at R equal to 0, so therefore the Q equal to 0, maybe I'll use a different color. Q equal to 0, growth rate is 0. And then it goes down again. And for R greater than 0, the Q equal to 0, I don't have any other color. I do have. Is this making sense?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So in some sense, this is like the looking at the linearized spectrum of the linearized operator, right? And this basically tells you whether the stability of the system is going to lose the stability or gain some stability. So for this system, the control parameter is still R, and R positive or negative is really what controls the whole dynamic. So this is R negative, this is R equal to 0, and this is R positive. So we got back similar things what we had for the ODE model, that R as it crosses 0 induces an instability of the homogeneous state U star equal to 0. Can you please do this for me now? That I want to look at the similar spectrum for the other fixed points. U star equal to, let's say, root R, and work that out and tell me if there is something non-trivial that happens. Again, for various values of R. So remember, for R negative, this doesn't even make sense. I mean, the state itself does not exist. So it's only for R positive. And so just sketch this for me for R positive. What is its value at Q equal to 0? Positive, negative?
Negative.
Okay, and then go up, go down as you go in Q. Down, okay. So this is for one particular value of R positive. Let's say R1, which is greater than 0. Can you do it for another value of R1, R, which is also positive, and say maybe R2, which is greater than R1? So remember, we have the parameter R, we are tuning it, and I'm trying to ask whether the U star equal to plus minus root R states are stable or unstable to inhomogeneous perturbations. Right? 2R, not 2R squared. So the question is therefore the following. Is there any R at which lambda of Q, remember for R positive, at which lambda of Q becomes positive? No? Okay. So therefore for all R greater than 0, you can show the other one is also the same thing, is stable. Okay. So this is a boring kind of a thing. You didn't get anything new. But the idea was to set up this formalism and now go to something which will start showing some non-trivial pattern forming instabilities. Okay. So what I want to do in the next class is to discuss what is called a canonical example of pattern formation. Depends who you ask as canonical. Something called the Swift-Hohenberg equation, which really comes from some simplified picture of the Rayleigh-Bénard convection, and do the linear stability analysis for that, and show you that as a function of certain tuning parameters, you can actually start getting non-trivial pattern formation. So the equation will turn out to be similar RU minus U cubed as usual, and you will get something like 1 plus dx squared the whole square. And this I will show you when we do the linear stability analysis. We'll start giving spectra, which will, depending on parameters, which will turn out to be of the following kind. So you'll find that beyond certain parameter values, there'll be a certain set of inhomogeneous spatial perturbations which will grow. So which means the homogeneous state will become unstable. Which one? The homogeneous state there is. U star equal to 0 homogeneous state there is. So I'm saying that if you want a pattern to come, you typically want it at some non-zero Q. Because Q equal to 0 is just a homogeneous state. So you found out something like you're tuning R, there is a U star equal to 0 state, stable, U star equal to 0 state, marginally stable, U star equal to 0 state, unstable. And that's exactly what you got with the ODE analysis. And this is the first Q which goes unstable is basically Q equal to 0. So it's almost the same thing as the homogeneous state. Yeah, sure. But the first one, the growth rate is highest at Q equal to 0. The critical point of instability is at Q equal to 0. Sure, there are other ones if you go to higher R. But the growth rate will be the maximum at R Q equal to 0. The U star equal to root R or plus or minus root R. We just argued that no matter what R, it's always stable. Again, it's homogeneous. I'll show you that if you look at the homogeneous steady states of this and do inhomogeneous perturbations for that, the spectrum that you will get will be such that the homogeneous state will have a negative growth rate, which means it is stabilizing the homogeneous state. But the inhomogeneous perturbations will grow. So which means it will pick out a particular wavelength. And that's a pattern. So your job is now to find out, what are the conditions that will make this unstable, which modes will become unstable, what is the Q, what is it compared to boundary conditions, the system size, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the crux of the game. I will illustrate this with reaction diffusion patterns. We'll start with Swift-Hohenberg, reaction diffusion patterns, and if you can go fast enough, some active patterns. Yeah, there was a question.
So to classify instability, we only have to look at the maximum value of lambda.
Maximum and also the location of the maximum. I mean, okay, I'll classify this. So it will turn out that at Q equal to 0, what happens, and whether the instability first comes at some non-zero Q, whether the eigenvalues are real or complex, all those things matter. So we'll classify the pattern forming instabilities. There'll be 3 classes with each one of them having 2 subclasses.
Okay.
Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. If you have some questions, you can bug me because the other one will take more work and I won't be able to do that. And if there are troubles with this, we can discuss this in the tutorial today again. But I'm hoping we'll do the numerics. We'll set up the numerics so that by the time I do some linear stability analysis, you have some numerics which you can play around and see the patterns. Sound good?
Yeah, why we are neglecting R less than 0 in the second case? Like U star is root R. Is that the reason or something else?
No, we said that for R less than 0, the other state doesn't even exist for real U, no? It'll be imaginary.
By other state, you mean U star is root over R?
Huh? Root of minus R.
Yeah, so it's an imaginary number, but it's an imaginary there.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
So if U is a real field, that doesn't even exist.
okay.
So there are a couple of things. So one is, as you tune parameters, new fixed points can come up. We saw that R less than 0, there's only one 0 fixed point, but R positive, there are other 2 fixed points as well. So as you tune parameters, certain fixed points may lose or gain stability. On top of that, if you have a spatial system, you can find out that there are inhomogeneous perturbations that can grow. If there's only homogeneous perturbations that grow or decay, it's basically an ODE system at the end of the day.
Vijay, so in this case, for U star equal to 0 becomes unstable when R is greater than 0. So I guess it goes to the other fixed homogeneous.
Plus root R or minus root.
Either of them depending on initial
condition. The basin of attraction. Okay, so we'll break there then and then come back in the